let's bring Ivan on stage. So, Ivan from Motion App, it's great to connect again here today. And how are you doing?
I'm good, Phil. How are you? You've been
I'm,
moderating away, using the voice. You feeling okay?
yeah. And I had like a sore throat this morning. And today you're going to talk about bridging the gap between media buyers and creative teams. And obviously, I'm a huge fan of Motion.
I appreciate you, sir. Everybody else here, welcome to the party. I'm happy that everyone's joining me today. And I'm super excited to dive into how we can help bridge the gap between media buyers and creative teams. For those of you that were checking out, I was checking out the end, which is great. But Mike's conversation that he was having with Phil, I think this will bleed nicely into what we're here to talk about today. Sweet. So today, like I had mentioned, we're really focusing on like bridging the gap between media buyers and creative teams. But before I get into the meat and potatoes here, Phil had mentioned a little bit about Motion, but everybody, my name is Evan. I'm the head of creative strategy here at Motion, which means that I get to chat with great brands, agencies, everyone in between about all things creative strategy. And Motion is the home for creative strategy at the end of the day. And what that means is ultimately creative has become the most important lever of success, as you all know, especially within the ad accounts, whether it be iOS 14 driven or creator economy driven. But what we also know is that on one hand, like a lot of folks here, we have our media buyers who are super analytical, but then we also have creative folks on the other side. And those creative folks are exactly that, more creative. So what that does is these two sides of the brain with these two teams that are involved ultimately create a natural friction between them when they need to operate in lockstep. So how we view creative strategy and what I'm going to talk about today is how we can actually help bridge that gap between the analytical side and performance marketing folks, as well as the creative teams on the other end. But how Motion ultimately helps tell this story of bridging this gap is we make it really easy to analyze exactly what's going on in the account, visualize specific insights along the way, and ultimately share this information with executives, creative team members, and anyone who might be involved in this process. So that's ultimately what we have going on. And now let's get into the meat and potatoes here of like bridging the gap between media buying and creative teams. I think the very first question to actually tackle here is ultimately what is creative strategy before we talk about how media buyers can embody this and execute against this. So when I'm talking about creative strategy, what I'm ultimately looking at here are a set of steps that you can follow to produce the best creative element possible. So these are a lot of steps. I definitely understand that. But what we're able to do is ultimately conduct some research to build out a persona. We're able to look at ideation to understand what angles, hooks, concepts resonate with the personas, move to briefing as that translation layer, ultimately create some great assets that'll be approved during our evaluation stage, and then launch those live in the ad account. And finally, evaluating based on data if those creatives performed well against said personas. So when we're talking about bridging the gap, it's really a set of steps that you can start to follow to produce the best creative possible. And the big thing here is like, we're here all to talk about media buying, scaling in the accounts. So when I'm thinking about the media buyers and why you need to care about creative strategy, it's like we've talked about previously, creative is the number one lever of success when we're talking paid advertising. But understanding where to start is sometimes hard. But what we also want to do is we want to make sure that as media buyers, like Mike was talking about, you all have a purpose. You're in those ad accounts not controlling, but understanding the algorithm, where it's spending your money, the demographics associated, and creative performance. And most definitely, you don't want to have to rely on others for the success that's happening in your ad account. So when I think of the creative strategy workflow I was showcasing with all of these different steps, I don't necessarily mean that you have to start doing all of these things overnight. I like to meet everyone where they are and the steps that they're most comfortable with. I've outlined each of these individual pieces. Go ahead and tackle the whole thing, but where I'm going to draw your attention to are the yellow boxes that we have here. So launching is, of course, live into the ad account, making sure you're taken care of and you're good to go. But where I wanted to focus on as a secondary step is the creative analysis side of things. So I'm going to get into a lot of detail and examples in a bit. But when we're thinking about creative analysis here, this isn't just on your end in the ad account, understanding what's working and what's not. What I really mean here is when we're looking at creative data, how can this actually inform and work with our creative team to ultimately produce better output? So I think this is a natural step that everyone here, if you're not already doing, can take it quite easily before moving into some of these other examples in the flywheel in just a second. So that's the reason why, like, everyone ultimately on the media buying side needs to care about creative strategy. And where I like to transition to a little bit is like, why is this creative strategist hat that you all wear actually important? And as I had showcased, there's so many different steps that you would follow with set outcomes. But basically, not only are there so many different steps, there's a lot of teams involved in this process. So as a media buyer who's diving into some of the creative strategy workflow to work better with creative teams, you're now going to be managing relationships with brand teams who care about a specific look and feel, creative teams that have specific output requirements, and then management teams who ultimately just want to pulse on look and feel. So what you're going to be, or what the benefit is of you focusing on this is you can build better relationships that hopefully produce better outcomes. And you're going to start turning just like meaningless creative findings that are just data points all over the place into order that now everyone can tie together and start actioning against. So this is what starts to happen when we think of going on here. After we're in a spot where we actually have like a little bit of order, we understand the steps to follow, the biggest thing starts to become, as a media buyer, what do I do tomorrow to actually be able to introduce these sprints? The examples that I'll cover later will be super helpful for this. But what I think about is an agile methodology of a creative sprint. And when we're thinking about how we actually run like consistent testing, at least within a creative sprint, there's two things that I want everyone here to consider. Now, the two categories that you're going to consider when thinking of a creative sprint is our new concepts and variations bucket. Now, think of heavy lifts. Think of things like your marketing calendar, net new promos, new product launches, and everything in between. This is what we're looking at when we look at new concepts and variations. And then the second bucket here are iterations. Iterations are just going to be smaller changes to existing creative assets that are rooted in data. Because once you're able to bucket them into these two buckets, what you can actually do is you can build an appropriate cadence to model your sprint methodology against. So when I'm looking at this pretty example that we have, what you're starting to see here is that our net new concepts, we've identified them as heavier lifts that need to take place. So what I'm doing here is I'm working with the rest of the people involved to ultimately say, hey team, I acknowledge that these are heavy lifts, but can we get these done every 30 days? Let's try our best to be able to make that happen. So that means everyone else, including yourself, is on the same page of the workflow that's about to come your way. And the great thing about this is you're not only picking between new concepts and iterations. What you're actually doing is you're creating space for both. So on top of just the new concepts that you'll be able to bang out on a 30-day cadence, you can actually look at iterations and say, team, this isn't as big of an ask. It's rooted in the data, and I want to make a really small change here. Can we commit to every 14 days to make this happen? So this process is going to allow you to create that predictable workflow that's going to output better creative efficiency and generate some more dollars. So that's what we look at from a holistic level of a creative sprint. The question that I typically get here, though, is like, Evan, this looks super great, but what the heck? How do I determine what works for my brand as an individual? So where I like to bring this to are two main questions that you'll want to start to answer. And the first question is going to be super familiar to media buyers. And that's where we're actually looking at our testing bucket. So testing, essentially what it means, as everyone knows, it's just like how long are we live in the ad account for to generate enough spend to actually be statistically relevant. So when are we ready to make decisions? And you'll be able to vary this depending on your spend, but it typically ranges from that 7 to 30-day mark, might even be sooner. That's the first bucket to care about. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight is media buyers, we can't forget about our friends, ultimately on the creative end, who are along us for this journey. So the other piece that we need to bake into this process is actually accounting for how long it takes to produce a single creative asset. So this is where I go back to either like SLAs, standard agreements, or a handshake agreement, where we're saying, okay, team, new concepts, can we do that 14 to 45 day window? Versus the iterative side, can we do a shorter window of 3 to 10 days or something along those lines? This process ultimately brings you to a place where you can actually map out based on spend, based on SLAs, how frequently you can actually look at injecting and creating new creatives into the ad account, essentially. So I bring us back to our trusty sprint cycle here. So after we have our cadence, this is really where it comes back to the different steps that are required to produce the ultimate creative output. And like I had mentioned at the beginning of the call here, we're talking about research to build our personas, ideating to understand our plan of attack, briefing to communicate it, and then everything along the way. And what you're going to be doing by focusing on bridging this gap with creative team members is it keeps you in the driver's seat. So what I wanted to do now to take us home with this is ultimately get to some examples along the way, because as easy and straightforward as these sound, what are some best practices for how we can make this come to life? So when we're thinking of these examples, the first place that I'm going to start is ultimately with the research bucket. So research, what's going on here? We're building those personas, and I have a very simplified version. I'm sure there's detailed versions around. I just wanted to give people a general idea. And we think about where to start when building our personas. I like to split it into two separate buckets. The first bucket that we care about is what do we know to be true about the brand that we're working for or the brand that we are working with. And this is where we'll actually dive into like the brand value props and the USPs that we know to be true, some of the past purchaser information that's available, and any ad data or historical performance that's actually available to tell us a little bit of the story of who's buying from us. So that's the first step. It's the what do we know to be true. But then the other piece is understanding what people are saying about you. So there's so many different ways that you can do this, but where I like to start are some of these different examples. The first thing that you can do is you can actually comb through either your like organic social or your paid ads to understand the type of comments that are happening on your creatives. So, or your ads or your posts. You can start to learn things like what do people care about, the pain points they're complaining about, things they're happy about, all that kind of stuff. You can actually extrapolate this now to your website, whether it be Amazon or literally your website, to understand the reviews and what people like, what people don't like. And for look and feel based, you can actually dive into your tagged posts on social to understand how people are posting about you and what they resonate with from a look and feel perspective to help bake out who your buyer is. So that's the first step that I like to think about when we're looking at what we know about your brand and how people are ultimately talking about you. A couple people I always like to shout out is Sarah Levinger. For those of you who know her, when she talks about personas, like we're directors, not the screenwriters. We want to let people embody who this persona is. And then my good friend Patrick, something he talks about is tagged posts are how people are really talking about you at the end of the day. So we never want to ignore that as much as we believe certain things to be true. And now that we've built our personas out, we move to the next stage of ideation. So like I was mentioning, ideation is all about finding those hooks, angles, look and feel to line up with the personas that we've ultimately built. So from an ideation perspective, there's a bunch of ways to do it. You can just have like a shared group chat and it's like hackiest way with your team where you send some back and forth to understand what's working. You can have your spreadsheets with competitor information so you can see who they are, what they're running, what's working and what's not. But there's also tools out there like Foreplay that you can dive in to be able to save specific information to make that come to life. And on top of your competitor inspiration, you'll never want to overlook your own data as well. So what's been going on, who's been buying from you, what's the look and feel that's been resonating that we ultimately want to lean into. That's what we're looking at there. Media buyers in the house, I had spoken about the creative strategy workflow and just taking a quick step back here, I had recommended that a really good place for everyone to start was actually with the data. So not only just analyzing it for your own optimization in ad accounts, but actually communicating with different people along the way to make creative decisions. So I actually wanted to go through 3 different examples here. And what these are going to be rooted in are different data points, ultimately. So of course, we have our bottom of funnel metrics where we're talking conversion rates, return on ad spend, CPAs, CPLs, all that good stuff. But we're actually going to lean in heavily to those engagement metrics. So understanding our video from start to finish and everything in between. So where I'll start from an example standpoint, and again, a million ways, I've just picked 3 here, is when we're looking at videos, I'm actually going to focus on our hook or thumb stop performance. So what I'm actually caring about here as a media buyer wanting to tell these stories is I'm comparing a couple metrics that I talk about all the time. What I have here is my thumb stop ratio as my primary metric, and I'm comparing that to my click-through rate as my secondary metric right here. For those who don't know, and just to paint a little bit of the picture, What thumb stop ratio or hook rate is measuring? It's measuring how many people actually stop their scrolls to watch the first 3 seconds of a video. In layman terms, why it's so important is we need someone to stop their scrolls before they click and go anywhere at the end of the day. So that's why. And when we bring this to data analysis, what I like about insights like this is that it's so easy to determine what to do next. So in this example, what we can see in this area that's been highlighted is we actually have a much lower thumb stop ratio in comparison to the rest of the account, but a higher click-through rate in comparison to the rest of the account. What this actually tells me is like, hey, not too many people are stopping their scrolls, but those who are stopping are clicking at a high clip. I'm happy about that. And what I can do here now, after I identify this, I can actually set goals with my creative team related to this specific creative. I can start to set goals like, hey team, for this creative right here, let's try to increase our thumb stop ratio so more people are stopping their scrolls, but maintain a similar click-through rate because my overall message is absolutely smashing it right now. So that means team, maybe you do 2 new versions, one's with a different thumbnail, one with a different 3 seconds, something along those lines. And the team can actually pick from the top of what's actually crushing it as an example. So that's a way that you're going from strictly reporting and making decisions in the ad account to actually analyzing to determine what to do next with your creative team. That's the first place I like to start. Another example that I like to hone into is we spent our time previously talking about the first 3 seconds, but I'm actually going to dive into the post 3 second experience now. So actually some of that storytelling at the end of the day. And again, similar experience of area for improvement. In this specific report, I've made a couple changes to the metrics that I'm looking at. And what that means is I've swapped or I've moved our thumb stop ratio to actually include CTR at this point. And I'm comparing this to how many people actually watch the video in its entirety. So I look at this as a rate rather than a volume number to know how many people make it to the end. And why I really like this report is because it makes it so simple to understand like where our attention should be. Bringing it here again to the bottom right, what we start to notice is that our click-through rate this time, not thumb stop ratio, but our click-through rate is much lower in comparison to the rest of the account. But we also notice that our 100% video play rate is much higher in comparison to the rest. Now, this is super interesting because clearly we have some content that is resonating with people at the end of the day. We're just not getting them to click. So when I'm working with my creative team, it allows me to set certain parameters. I might say, hey team, an option that we can play to actually increase our click-through rate is let's change the language on our CTAs. Even better, let's move our CTAs up earlier in the video to get people to click so they're driven to where I want them to go. So you can start to make, based off data, all of the different analyses that then correlate to the changes that your creative team will be making for you. So you're operating in lockstep. That's another example that I have here. And then the final example, just to get deeper into the data to round it out, is I actually wanted to start talking about different pieces outside of just creative. And that means identifying areas of where we might have a creative issue versus a landing page issue. Because as many times as you want your creative team to produce great output for you, they might already be doing a great job and the emphasis needs to be placed somewhere else. So the example that I can share here is in this specific report, I'm comparing, again, a couple different metrics. I'm leading with my click-through rates, once again, of course, but I'm comparing that to my click-to-purchase ratio, also known as our conversion rate. And why these two relationships are so important to find if we have a creative issue or a landing page issue is very similar to this first example that we can see right here. So what I'm ultimately looking at is a nice and high CTR in comparison to some of the other stuff we see. But I'm also noticing that my conversion rate here isn't as strong as I ultimately wanted. 3 is still great. Maybe we want it stronger, right? So what this is telling me is when I'm working with the team, people are clicking and they're going where I want them to go at the end of the day. But once they get there, they're not buying as much. So the first thing I can do is like congratulate the creative team. We've produced something that's generating a lot of engagement. But then the next thing that I'm doing is I'm looking at the landing page to understand relationships. Does the landing page have similar content to what was in the ad? Are we including similar UGC creators and value props that we're ultimately showcasing? This is how you can start to round out the story beyond just like work in your own ad account, creative, and different team members along the way. Okay, folks? I know that's a ton of information when we're just talking about, because really what we've done is we've built our personas and we've understood look and feel to understand what's going on here, right? But when we move forward, the big thing starts to become briefing, because we have some great information. And the last thing we want to do is drop the ball and not actually be able to translate this to creators or designers along the way. So within briefing, similar to how I talk to creative sprints, there's 2 buckets and lenses to look at this through. The first bucket is our net new creatives. So mind you, I know everyone has briefing that they probably follow. This is just an example to showcase some of the things we'll look at. But we'll include things like personas, value props we focus on, hypotheses, examples, goals, all of that good stuff. Be sure to include it. But you can also be hyper specific with this specific element too. So if I move our briefing over from net new creative to iterations, you can start to set the hypotheses that you're running with very related to data. So like I'm saying, that natural next step for most folks in this room. So what that means is going back to my examples that I was just showcasing, and if we're focused on hooks or thumb stop ratios, I can start to set hypotheses that are literally saying, team, on paper, this week, what we're going to do is we're going to increase our thumb stop ratio and maintain our conversion rate or click-through rate so we make some additional sales. And I'm making it so digestible for the creative team, they don't have to worry about it. I'm just saying for these 2 versions, Scented with Love and Lavender Hallway, let's produce a couple more so we're able to get it into the account to see if we can do what we do. So once it's so straightforward and clear that it's an easy next step, I'm simplifying if we have any creative team members in the room. It becomes really easy for them to take that, iterate, and then provide a creative for you to then run with. And once you're actually in a spot where you've run it in the ad account and have some data, the last step in this cycle is actually understanding and not forgetting about how that test actually performed. So that's where we move to our creative analysis stage in terms of a retrospective. To round out what we have going on, what I'd like to emphasize here is like, you ran a test. Sometimes you throw this information of the test into the abyss and you're like, hey, did it work? Did it not? What went down? But we want to make sure that this information is readily available to you at all times. So that means is in this specific retrospective, I'm leading with my hypothesis of increasing thumb stop ratio and maintaining conversion rate. And I'm going through this information to actually see and validate, is my hypothesis true or false? So to go over this super quickly, in terms of the data that I have here, on the far right side, mind my language, you can change this to what you need. I call this version here our control group. And with the control group of the creative, it's the version that's been live in the ad account the entire time and the version that you've decided to make changes off of. Nice and easy. Right beside that, I have our version 2, and our version 2 is that thumbnail and 3-second change. And then right beside this in the green, I have our version 3. So that's just the thumbnail change, for example, something along those lines. And once I have these all stacked side by side on an appropriate time frame, I can actually go ahead and see if my hypothesis was true. So with this control group, what I want to see is a much higher thumb stop ratio in comparison to the rest, and a and a conversion rate in a similar range. So I can see here that version 2, that thumbnail and 3-second change, it crushed it. It did what I needed to do. So that's a true statement. But our version 3 there, which was just a thumbnail change, I might have given the algorithm some incorrect information to go find might find the wrong person for us. So people are clicking, but they're not buying at the end of the day. So once I see something like this, it becomes super helpful, because what I can do is I can say, hey, this is true, this is false. Let's try these tests again. 3-second changes are absolutely killer. But what I will acknowledge is like, this is one, and I won't say a million, but it doesn't always work out this way. Most likely it's going to be false and false. And the good thing about a sprint cycle is you can just try net new things all the time from start to finish to be able to actually generate the data needed and hopefully find a new winner. Cool. I had talked about, I like to shout out the community, and like I had talked about, hey, you have these tests that you'd run and you need to evaluate them like we've spoken about here. And then the question becomes, where do you track it? I have a couple examples in here. These are templates from Rahul and Connor that I quite like. You can grab those if you'd like to capture those test information. You'd be good to go. And then additional opportunities for creative analysis. Why I say this is because, like I mentioned, if you're not finding any winners, the question starts to become, what can you try? And there's different things that you can start to dive into, like seeing which influencers are working best for you, so you can start generating new creative with specific influencers. You can do the same thing for personas, products, all that good stuff. In summary, folks, I know I hit you with a lot of information here. There's so many different steps you can follow to ultimately get started. Like I'd mentioned, as media buyers, where I recommend is just getting into the data. But if there's anything that you take away from this presentation, you don't necessarily have to implement this process overnight. What my recommendation always comes to is start with an initial hypothesis. You've run a test in an ad account. Why are you really doing it? And once you know that and you've penciled that down, make sure you bake in some structure to actually come back to say, was it good or not? Because once you're aligned, it makes it much easier on all fronts to understand what's going on there. Cool, everybody. So that's me. I know I say a lot of words in a short amount of time. If there's any questions that pop up, please, please, please throw it into the chat. But I hope this is helpful in talking about like what immediate next steps can look like to be able to produce the best creative output possible.
That's absolutely great. Yeah, teams that don't adopt those creative sprints, are going to be left behind next year for sure. There's a question from Mickey in the chat. So from what time do you get the data in Motion? Is it from the time you install Motion, or is it retroactive? How does that happen?
Good question. So from a platform experience, we make it super easy. So everything's hooked up via API, no tech or dev left needed, and you'll get the history of your ad account within 10 to 15 minutes. So you're good to go.
Like, how long does it take usually? What do you see like the best right now? And is that like a weekly period so that like next Monday they're ready to launch a new set of creatives?
This is the fun part, because as media buyers, we think, I don't know if we think this, sorry, but it's been a hot take, like media buying is going extinct. But I truly believe like there's a role for the media buyer, like obviously understanding the algorithm, how they're distributing our money, what creatives are actually resonating. But this is another example of where a media buyer comes to play. Based on the spend that you're managing for a brand or a client that you might have, if you're agency side, this is where you're going to be able to chunk out and say, how much spend do I actually need to accumulate to determine something is stat sig? So what that means is if like you're spending $1 million a week, you're going to hit that quick. You might be banging out creative every 5 days, for example. But if you're only spending, I say only, I know it's varying ranges, but let's say you're spending 20K a month and that budget is a lot smaller. That cycle is going to be a lot longer for you, right? Like you're going to be looking at closer to 21 to 30 days, and that's okay. Just focus on your iterations and bang those out a little bit quicker. So that's the best way I can answer that one.
How many ads do they ship? Like, do you have any visibility or insight on how they're like adding those to the account?
I have all the visibility, so I will say this.
And everything. So
we're super lucky. We're super lucky we get the insight. I'll share like different examples of what I've seen, and then I'll mention like preference more or less. So the first example is usually lower spend, and what this is traditionally looking like is you have an existing structure and you're just plopping a new ad into an existing ad set. So you just want to see like, does Facebook actually shift and say what's going on? That's the first example. The next example that I've seen are literally specific campaigns that are set up. So that's where your creative sandbox exists, your testing campaigns, that kind of stuff. So that's where you move from test to scale. And then the third thing that I've seen are within campaigns, specific ad sets that you'll go live with. So within those ad sets, they can either be specific to audiences, keep them broad, or specific even influencers. If you're spending enough money, you might just have one dedicated to a specific influencer. So those are the three things that I've seen. And typically with number of ads that exist within each of these ad sets, it's usually in the world of 5 to 10 on that range. So that's what I typically see. My personal preference here, though, in all honesty, this might be a little bit of a hot take, is I actually like to run creative tests in DCOs first. So I maintain ad text, headlines, landing pages, and CTAs and vary up the creative. Once I actually understand which creative the money is going to and performing the best, I will pluck that out and throw it into an Advantage Plus campaign. All of a sudden, that Advantage Plus campaign is going to be stacked with all of the DCO or DCA, DCT winners. So what you're looking at there is just like a super Advantage Plus ad at that point. A little bit of a hot take, but I've seen that be super cool and work.
And you're gracious enough to offer the audience 50% off for 3 months of Motion. So I'll post this offer right now in the chat. Use the code NB50 for 50% off for 3 months. Ivan, that was really, really great.